One thing that gives me cause for concern is that most people don't seem to understand the relationship between what we call the worldly and the transcendent. And furthermore, many don't understand the important role that worldly or conventional reality has to play in the quest for the ultimate meaning. As Nagarjuna famously taught, without understanding the conventional, then there is no understanding the ultimate. And without realizing the ultimate, there is no transcendence from suffering. We feel as if the transcendent is something exclusively the domain of supernatural experiences, embellished by religious iconography and spiritual terminology. We feel as if we need to abandon the conventional or physical world in order to achieve some transcendent metaphysical state that is somehow separate from conventional reality. If we look at the way that the Buddha taught the Dharma, then we can see immediately that this is definitely not the case. If we look at the Sigala Sutra, for example, where the Buddha gives some advice to a young layman that he meets on the road, we can see immediately that the Buddha did not spend any time discussing high philosophical views or transcendental states. Rather, the Buddha enumerated the 4 defiled actions, that is, taking life, stealing, sexual misconduct, and lying. The 4 causes of evil actions, those being sensual desire, hatred, ignorance, and fear. The 6 ways of squandering wealth, indulging in intoxicants, taking to the streets at inappropriate times, attending public spectacles, compulsive gambling, evil friendships, and bone idleness. The Buddha highlighted forming meaningful relationships, what a true friend is, and what a true friend is not, and also how to aid others in attaining a peaceful life. And finally, the importance of maintaining close relationships with parents, teachers, partners, acquaintances, mendicants, and servants. So as you can see here, what the Buddha was teaching was not some esoteric dogma specific to a particular tradition, but sound, common sense advice about living one's ordinary life in a meaningful and virtuous manner. And this theme repeats itself consistently throughout the continuum of the Buddhist teachings over a span of 2,600 years, from the time of the Buddha's enlightenment up until the present day. For example, there are the 100 verses of advice given by Padampa Sangye to the simple peasants of the village of Tingri, the Indian yogis' adopted home in the mountains of Tibet. Padampa Sangye didn't teach them high tantric practices or complex monastic discipline. What he taught those simple villagers was a way of being in the mundane world that was conducive to happiness and harmonious interactions. For example, he taught them that one should not be overly concerned with wealth and poverty. Rather, that what we need to be wary of is our own avarice, because it is that which in future times will cause us hardships and suffering. Of course, in order to get this point across, then a spiritual teacher needs to deliver their message in a particular cultural framework. For example, Patrul Rinpoche lived in the 19th century in eastern Tibet, where most people were nomads or simple hill farmers. The stories and analogies that he uses are specific to that way of living. Whereas a 19th century nomad from eastern Tibet will be very familiar with the practice of extracting wool from a live yak, a modern Westerner will struggle to understand the context and the meaning of this analogy. This is how it is. A skillful Dharma teacher will use metaphors and analogies that resonate with their intended audience. The stories are intended to evoke a strong visceral feeling in the minds of the listeners, so they can connect with the intended inner meaning of the teachings. and so it would be rather unusual for a modern 21st century Western Dharma teacher to use such analogies where the intended listeners lack the cultural framework for interpreting them. And that's because the intent of a Dharma teaching is not to perpetuate a particular culture or tradition. The intent of a Dharma teaching is to instill a particular feeling or understanding in the mind of the listener. And so, for example, if one were to teach the meaning of the negative consequences of sauntering in the streets at unseemly hours from the aforementioned Sigala Sutra, it's going to be a hell of a lot more productive to use the example of me and my mates going out on a bender or painting the town red than trying to talk about the nightlife in an agrarian village in ancient India, whatever the hell that might be like. So for me, if I'm going to explain Padampa Sangye's advice, whoever gets power acts sinfully too. O people of Tingri, abandon all concern for rank and power. Then I'm sorry, I'm not going to give you an example of a mythical king with miraculous powers. I'm going to talk about the richest man in the world, or a dictator like Vladimir Putin. And why? Because these are people whose lives and stories we are familiar with, and in a context that we can readily understand. Of course, one can skillfully use well-known figures from history or mythology to get a Dharma point across. But in the back of one's mind, there will always be the thought that this is mere pedagogy, or somehow irrelevant in the modern era. There is a purpose in teaching these allegorical stories from the ancient scriptures. For one, it can be an inspirational way of engaging with the meaning of the Dharma, and this is especially relevant for those with prior study in Buddhist philosophy and the sutras. But whenever a teacher explains these parables, then almost invariably they will use modern examples to get the allegorical or intended meaning across to their students. In the instructions on the preliminaries, it speaks of the 8 states without freedom, and one of these states is the state of a barbarian. And this is a point that often needs to be clarified for Western students, because when we hear the term barbarian, what comes to mind is some axe-wielding warrior from the Middle Ages, or a cannibal with a bone through his nose from an island in the South Pacific. One of my own teachers, Taisutto Rinpoche, a Tibetan Lama with many Western students, often explains that in fact, contrary to popular belief, there are many barbarians in the modern Western world. The example he uses to get the point across is the modern industrial abattoir, and how those who work in this industry use shockingly barbaric methods in order to increase their productivity. For instance, instead of herding the cattle from one place to another, and in order to facilitate transporting them in large numbers, their legs are broken, and they are moved about using forklifts. And because the cattle are sold by weight at the market, and in order to stop them from losing mass through dehydration, their tongues and rectums are burnt out using red-hot irons. There is no denying that these techniques are unimaginably cruel, and the people that engage in these practices can be considered barbarians. That is, in the context of the Buddhist teachings, where we are taught one should have love and compassion for all beings, right down to the smallest worm. So these stories are extremely unpleasant, and one might very well wonder why on earth anyone would want to listen to these horrors. But that's the whole point. We need to give rise to a strong visceral feeling, and by that come to understand the inner meaning of these teachings that goes beyond the mere words. My own teacher will often use modern examples in order to get a particular point across. Now, many of the students at the retreat in Nepal are Chinese, and on one occasion my Lama was trying to get across a point about the intense negativity of this Chinese practice of cooking animals alive, and so he showed us some videos that he found on the internet. People post these videos thinking that they are informative, entertaining and exciting, but for most Westerners this kind of content is extremely disturbing. I mean, nobody wants to see a poor animal being cooked alive. It seems sadistic, or even quite perverse. In the end, one German nun was so shocked that she even fainted, and many people looked like they wanted to vomit. I have to say that if you gave this kind of Dharma teaching in the West, it's quite likely that you would be arrested and taken to court, as if you were doing it solely to traumatize your students. I have no doubt, if you posted such content on YouTube, it would be immediately taken down. In fact, your channel would most likely be deleted as well. But again, the point here isn't to traumatize your students by showing them graphic images. Rather, for those students to give rise to a strong visceral feeling, and by that, develop an uncontrived conviction and the negativity of harming any sentient being. The Buddha himself was said to have shown his half-brother Nanda the horrors of the hell realms, and he did so in order that Nanda would give rise to renunciation, so that he would have an authentic cause for achieving awakening. But don't worry, I'm not going to show you any graphic videos or try to shock you into awakening. I just want you to understand my methods, and why, from time to time, I discuss what seem to be worldly affairs. As I said before, you're not going to achieve awakening by daydreaming about supernatural experiences or high philosophical views. Likewise, if you just get wrapped up in the cultural aspects of Buddhism, for example, the outer attire or ritual practices, then you are most likely going to completely miss the point. The purpose of practicing the path is for one to change one's mistaken way of thinking. And in order to do that, one needs to develop a strong conviction in the inner meaning of the teachings. Of course, if you've already realized the profound truth of the abiding nature, then you no longer need to change your way of thinking. It is enough to apply that realization to your daily activities, as it is taught. Before awakening, chop wood, carry water. After awakening, chop wood, carry water. Anyway, I haven't got much more to say on this topic at the moment. So good luck with your practice, and see you next time.